So welcome everybody to another GSI seminar series, seminar. And today we're going to have a really exciting talk. So today's speaker is Dr. Kerry Burton, and she's a postdoctoral research fellow here at the University of Exeter. And she's part of the Exeter Multidisciplinary Plastics Research Team, or EXAMPLR for short. So her research examines the role of civil society participation within natural resource management, environmental action and sustainability transitions. And she's going to be talking to us a little bit today about some of that stuff. So I'm going to just pass over to you now, Kerry.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for letting me have this opportunity to talk about a little bit about the project. And it's worth saying at this point that this was an 18-month project that was funded by the EPSRC, as you said, it's called EXAMPLR, the Exeter Multidisciplinary Plastics Research Hub. And it was funded under the Creative Circular Economy Approaches to Eliminating Plastic Waste. So it was one of 8 projects across the UK. And so we're just at the point where we're all coming together. All the money went to teams within one university per project, brings together people from across the university. So here in Exeter, I've been working with Joe Smith in psychology to look at behaviours and social practices, but we've also got teams looking at ecotoxicology of new sort of bioplastics. We've got people doing life cycle assessment, and I think Zhao Yuyan is giving a seminar in a few weeks. So we'll be touching on his work, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about that. Also looking at business, we've got marine conservation going on, and we've been looking at different elements as well as mine on the social impacts. So this has been looking at fishing and agriculture. So it's quite a big project, but quite a small time scale. So I just sort of wanted this to be understood as a very small part of something a lot bigger, for which lots of outputs will be coming out soon. I'm trying to move this along. So today I'll just sort of give a brief overview of plastics. Of course, it's risen up in a lot of political and public agendas recently, become a lot more visible. So I'll talk a bit about the good, the bad and the ugly of plastics. Then give an introduction to the circular economy, some claims it makes, critiques, and just sort of briefly discuss the inner loops, which is what we've been looking at, our research approach and methods, and then look at a bit more at the grassroots responses to plastic in the southwest of England. For the sake of this research, the southwest of England has been understood as Devon, Cornwall and Somerset. I think many of us started off with looking more broadly up to Gloucestershire and including Dorset, but it became too big for the scope of the project. So if I ever refer to the southwest, I am referring to those 2 counties, which obviously narrows it down and looks at quite a different sort of set of geographies than it would if we were including Bristol. And then we sort of look at the main aim of this research, which was sort of about reconfiguring relationships with plastic through circular practices of sharing and repairing. We also looked at reuse, and I do have one example in the case studies, but I don't think we'll necessarily get as far as looking more broadly at reuse. But we do have a couple of briefing reports that have been written through this research, which I'd happily share if anyone wants to email me afterwards. So plastics, a brief history. This was a book that actually belonged to my mum. My mum won it at school for her good artwork. And I was flicking through it as I started this project. And I thought it was quite interesting because a lot of craft books probably wouldn't have plastics on the front cover or as a topic. So this was quite interesting. The book was published in 1953 and probably gives quite a good indication of how plastics was being viewed. It was quite a new material then. And I really like, I mean, there's obviously quite a lot of problems beyond plastics going on in this, this quote from the book. But here I like the fact that it says, like Cinderella's fairy godmother, the chemist has looked around the kitchen, and from ordinary coal, oil, salt and water, he has magically produced a wonderful treasure house of materials called plastics. And it goes on to talk about how they are sort of becoming ubiquitous, from the sheerest nylon stockings to furniture and bathtubs. And I think this is one of the problems with plastic, and one of the joys perhaps of this miracle material, which is it's almost ubiquitous nowadays. Sort of 70 years on from when this book was published, avoiding plastic is quite difficult. So again, why is it so popular? Well, plastics are lightweight, they're malleable, they're durable, they're water resistant, and they're cheap and convenient. Of course, a note of caution with the cheap and convenient is that because a lot of the negative externalities are not included in the price. So made of oil, it has become a point of contestation on a number of issues, but plastics have revolutionized construction, healthcare, fashion, transportation, electronics, food packaging, communications and IT. And in fact, as I said just now, they're ubiquitous. I doubt very many of us, if we're working from home, can look around and not have plastic within our vision, let alone though we've got our laptops in front of us, most of us. So it's there. It can be a bad, it can be very problematic, but it has actually changed the way we live. And it would be very hard when we see some of the narratives that are very anti-plastic or get rid of plastics. Again, Gay Hawkins' work is really interesting on us, particularly her work on plastic bottles as artifacts, and thinking about how they're embedded in lots of different processes now. We might think of this as the social lives of stuff, of plastic items. They're much more than their material stuff. They really shape the way we live and the activities we can do, but have, as I said, become very embroiled in politics. So thinking about our uncomfortable relationships with stuff, and particularly plastics, within the last few years, I mean, a lot of people have talked about this as the blue planet effect, and when we look more locally, we can see that. But going back beyond that, there has been issues with plastic, mainly because of its impact on the environment. So before 2017 with Blue Planet, there's far more looking at the impacts of electronic waste, and particularly the long production of waste chains, where that was going, and the impact on the planet, on birds. I think more recently it's got entangled and been starting to enter narratives around the climate and ecological emergency. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that actually plastics, whilst there's been a lot of narrative and debate around them, public protests, policy discussions, policy coming in to ban certain things, the tax on plastic bags, plastic is still growing. And as this seal, which is the report came out in 2018, shows it's predicted to grow a lot more between now and 2050. And if we don't sort of start cutting back, there's going to be problematic for the CO2 emissions, for one thing, and that's in the production and the waste dealings. And on the environment, we already have sort of narratives about how there'll be more plastic in the sea than fish. So we have the single-use plastic and the electronic waste plastics that we've been particularly looking at here. We also have narratives that are coming out recently, and I think COVID has actually provided a space for people to be thinking about this as well, and bigger sort of narratives about the green and just transition, or the green recovery, and papers in Nature and in ecological and economics that have confronted growth and our need to confront consumption. I mean, this has been an issue, particularly in human geography, which is my sort of discipline, have been thinking about consumption for a long time, but I think it has now come to the point where the climate and ecological emergency has brought this to the fore. And so papers most recently saying that we have to confront consumption and affluence, and because if we can't have the green growth narrative, so people like Jason Hickel, etc., who have been promoting their sort of degrowth and post-growth narratives around consumption. So we have a lot of debates that we're sort of coming into this looking at that are both academic and beyond academia around consumption, but also around environmental, social and climate justice, the fossil fuel dependency, unsustainable resource use. Again, resource use is growing, even though there seems to be more emphasis on it within green narratives. It still continues to grow. And so we have these problems of people think they're attacking these things and changing their lifestyles, but actually things are still going along a negative trend. So one of the sort of proposed solutions to the problems of plastic, but resource management more widely, has been the circular economy. I'm not an economist, so my understanding of the circular economy is probably one step up from the lay understandings. So just there's sort of a disclaimer there. But one of the most widely used understandings of the circular economy is through confronting our sort of use of resources through the numerous loops and closed loop systems. And this is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been at the forefront of putting these through, and these models have been really important in both policy and public debates. So it's not without its critiques, the circular economy. For one of these that, and we've taken these on board in our research, one of these is that it is post-political. There's very little to challenge about a lot of the narratives within the circular economy, as in the move from a linear economy, which is the take, make and dispose, and the shift to a more circular, which keeps resources within the loops and within circulation. There's no challenge there. It's a bit like sustainable development in that most people don't want a wasteful society, or won't admit to wanting a wasteful society. So unless there's some flesh put onto those bones, there's very little to challenge there. Focus on green growth. While not all circular economy models do bring in the idea of growth, more and more we've seen this linked to growth, that you can have this sort of endless recycling of plastics or other materials and still have economic growth with them. So this is problematic, going back to the debates I talked about earlier around growth and post-growth, and whether you can really decouple consumption and carbon emissions, or whether you have to focus more widely on the reduction of consumption. There's also a problematic focus on technological fixes. It's around sort of ecological modernisation, and in a way this is about technology will save the day. So some things will come along which will sort out the problem. So really that we don't have to focus on people and their behaviour. This is also problematic from a business point of view if people are trying to introduce these, because we have a lot of businesses at the moment really want to bring in circular practices or closed loop systems whereby they can use materials that are readily recoverable and recyclable and can be used again. But the problem is, if you don't think about how people actually use those products, then that can be problematic. You may be just producing another item that isn't going to be used properly. And Evans et al. Have a recent paper about these, having to look at the social practices and why some new items don't get used. Also the greenwash, and I think particularly at the moment, there's a lot of products that are wanting to look clean, are more eco-friendly. So this is just one of the adverts I found recently, and this is from Johnson Brothers with 100% ocean plastic. So the recyclable bottle, and I think sometimes this greenwash has sort of covered up for dirty producers. And the arguments would be, so we have Coca-Cola making claims about how recyclable its bottle is, that its bottles aren't single use, and we have other sort of bottled water being sold as having eco credentials because the bottle is actually made from 100% recycled plastics. So we see these coming across as eco without perhaps thinking about the wider production processes and the products themselves, whether we actually need to have these products. Also within the circular economy, and this is down to narratives and not necessarily practices, as we'll look at later, is the focus on top-down processes and policy. So it is coming into a lot of policies at the moment, and I think it's been really powerful that it's been used within sort of different EU policies that want to engage with the circular economy. So where there are problems, I think there is also some signs of hope. But there's very little that has been looked at to do with grassroots use of the circular economy and how people are actually thinking about it. And for our project, I think there was a focus when we looked at the literatures on the circular economy. I think one of the things that jumped out at us is that there's a real focus on cities. We have quite a lot of circular cities emerging, but there's very little about those spaces beyond cities. So really for our region, I think we were offering something quite interesting in our research, which has been to look at those bottom-up processes, how the circular economy is understood from groups at the bottom and citizen-led projects, because it's actually been quite popular narrative within those. And also this focus of beyond cities, so beyond those urban conurbations that have everything, where everything is perhaps a little neater networked. It's easier for groups to be in touch, it's easier to share knowledge. So outside of that, we're looking at within our region, Devon, Cornwall and Somerset, of towns and small towns, villages, smaller cities that aren't necessarily connected up so easily and fall under a number of different local authorities. So there's not so much work on that, and on sort of, won't necessarily say it's all rural, but the non-urban, not so much work on the non-urban and the circular economy. So that was some critiques that we've looked at prior to sort of undertaking our research, to try and come up with some sort of hopeful spaces of the circular economy and pull some of it back into some positive spaces of hope. So the circular economy, as I said, it's actually quite useful within grassroots and looking at, and this image has been used quite a lot, and it comes from the Zero Waste Scotland, this particular one, but it has circulated quite a lot, so I'm not sure who the original creator of this visualization was. But it comes up a lot, and it comes up in the groups that we were looking at. And I think it acts as quite a powerful visual and an imagination to think of the system as different, because not against Ellen MacArthur's visualization, but this one certainly makes things a lot clearer that groups can get their heads around, individuals can get their heads around of how things move. So how it goes from that linear economy of everything ending up in the dustbin to the recycling economy that has a few different loops and it can go round in different circles, but then inevitably ends up in the bin, to the circular economy. But I would like to sort of say here, and particularly what we've found in our research, is that some of these narratives around loops, and here the circular economy is visualised very much as nothing ending up in the bin, and a lot of the narratives are around eliminating waste, eliminating the whole concept of waste. But it's not not as sort of neat and tidy as that. As Kate Rayworth says, there's going to be leakages. It's never going to be 100% sort of pure loops or closed loops. And I think in many ways that the narratives that you tend to come across that are very technical around the circular economy can be quite disabling to different groups if they focus on that too much, because there's something about the purity of closed loops. And I think here in our work, we're seeing it sort of reframed a bit, that people are looking at loops. So some of the inner loops, such as reuse and sharing, and thinking about how they can get in, how they can contribute without having to think of necessarily closed loop system, because that would be impractical and probably impossible for many groups to actually act within that. They haven't got the infrastructure there to be able to contribute to. So they're doing their bit. And I think this is where it becomes really important, more as an imaginary than the actual closed loops when we're talking about grassroots groups and citizen-led project. I think it's also a good imaginary that's bridging those policy and practice spaces, because it gives people something to talk through and talk to, and we're seeing it becoming quite popular within decision making in sort of place-based initiatives. So here's some examples of where it's coming into conversation with other narratives. So thinking about performing the economy differently, and the circular economy has become part of that. I think most interestingly and quite exciting is Amsterdam at the moment, who are using this with the donut economics methodology to really bring people in to this, the idea of bringing the place-based organising and decision making, which is also sort of starting in the UK. But in Amsterdam, we have a sort of major city where people are being brought in to think through these. And for those that don't know the donut economics methodology, it is where people and experts map the city and map lots of different elements of the city where change can take place, so that cities can function within planetary boundaries. But it's also coming to talk with diverse economies, which is very much how we've been using it, to think about how small actions and localized actions contribute to different changes and how they're performative. But within ideas of just transition and the Green New Deal, it's coming into conversations at both local and national and international levels, and sharing economies. And very important for our work is that relationship between, and the conversations between the sharing economies, literatures, and the circular economy. So the research approach and methods that we took for this, it was very much stakeholder-led from the beginning, which was to engage with people. So it actually started with stakeholder workshops. And from that, we could see that quite a lot was going on across the region, but a lot of people just knew about one or two initiatives that were happening. There was a real push, an emphasis on pro-environmental behaviour. Lots of people wanted to shift, wanted to change, or wanted to work with projects that were changing. And yet they either didn't know about them or they couldn't. And within also talking to the community groups within those stakeholder workshops, what a lot came out about those barriers. So it was on an individual basis, a lot of people were looking very much at single-use products and how they could change their relationships with that. So they were finding that they wanted to swap, or they didn't want packaging, or they didn't want to buy certain products, but it was very limited. And it was limited because they'd either go into the shops and they weren't there, or it was limited because things were more expensive to get, or you had to go to niche shops to be able to buy different things. So we had lots of repetitive ideas coming up. So lots of people who had swapped and were using a reusable bag or swapped to a bamboo toothbrush. And on the initiatives, we had a certain comes out, so it started to come out that there was people knew about repair cafes, or they knew about sharing libraries. So we took these sort of quite interesting to actually look and see what was happening. So we led off from that to sort of think about the motivations and opportunities and barriers that were driving people, and then to look at where these were happening and the different processes and practices that were being made undone and reclaimed. So there was sort of some new practices happening. People were noting them, they were talking about them, they were quite excited about them. But as I say, they knew sort of one or two. So it was quite interesting then to think about how we could map them. And it became interesting in the discussions we were having in the workshops, particularly the second workshop, which was focused on creating networks of change and looked at different values and different actors within the region. That was looking at what would be the co-benefits of these circular initiatives. So things went more circular, what came out of that, and just talking to groups who were involved in local organising and local development for local authorities, etc. There was a lot of talk about how this was bringing communities together. It was having a lot more effect beyond waste and resource management, or beyond dealing with single-use plastics. It was very much seen as something that had social benefits beyond those immediate environmental impacts. So we set about, after the stakeholder workshops, of network mapping, and a lot of this used the information that had been fed to us through the stakeholder workshops, and then snowballing out from them to find links and trawling. So trawling was using a lot of social media, different documents, going through council documents, who attended meetings, etc., looking within the wider networks and digging down to find out how many groups we could find and where they were. And as trying to be performative within the research, I think it was looking at these spaces and trying to identify them, but also map them publicly. So we have had them on the Exemplar platform, so people can access the maps of where things are happening. And these look like they're mainly citizen-led, but there are also some small shops and initiatives such as the Zero Waste Shop and the small medium enterprises that are reusing plastics and things. So there's quite a mixture on there. I think from the wider southwest up to Bristol, we found 300 initiatives that had plastic as one of their primary focuses. And then we've networked them down to make some different case studies, which is what we'll be talking about with the repair and sharing in a minute. We also went through social media and to do documentary of social media and documents to do content and discourse analysis. This included minutes of meetings, people's own way of how they promoted themselves with their motivations and things. So we had quite a clear outline of when they emerged and what their main narratives were. We did some site visits and these case study snapshots, which is what you can see in the corner here, and I'll look at a couple of those in more depth in a little while. And also we had the help of one of the geography, we had an intern from geography, Emma Darker, who worked on these and was absolutely excellent. So the mapping the initiatives. So this was taken very much from a lot of social movement research in the past, that networks where different movements things are. We found actually two that were looking most in depth to the plastics, was around the Surface Against Sewage, plastic free communities, and the transition towns, but both had very different narratives of how they looked at things. So whilst people had looked at the Blue Planet effect and the SEPA report on plastic pollution that came out in 2018, had noted the Blue Planet effect, we can see that actually So the top is the map that we made of different initiatives and clusters of initiatives, and then we've got the temporal map below when different groups came in. So we see 2008, that's mainly the transition towns, and then later in the 2017 we see a peak, which is plastic-free communities after the Blue Planet. So this wasn't all about Blue Planet that was going on. So those mainly affiliated to Surfers Against Sewage were focused on pollution, marine pollution, and this tended to lead to certain narratives within their promotions and their motivations, which was about the material and making material change, giving up plastic, very much about single-use plastic, lots of schemes such as beach cleaning, things. So, and the second group, the transition-linked groups, were far more about system change and looking at social practices and place-based working groups that already existed to look at plastic and make those links over to different streams of waste, such as food, and how you build low carbon societies. So it was much more within a broader scope of looking at plastic. And they tended to look at plastic waste more generally rather than the single-use plastic. So we're thinking about these different groups and what they were doing and thinking about the tangible changes they were making and the interventions. We also looked to the work of Zhao Yuyan and his team. That was because coming out at the same time as we were coming to the end of phase 1 of our research. And this looked more to plastic stocks and flows. There was quite a lot about the single-use plastic and the waste that goes out of households. It also became evident there's a lot of goods within households that have quite a sort of heavy plastic load to them. And these seem to be more difficult things to live without, but also to deal with. And there wasn't so much information on where they were going or how we moved beyond having these, because most of them are items that really sort of benefit our daily lives, some that we could say you couldn't do without. But you know, increasingly they are becoming disposable, and particularly the small electronic items. And these spoke to the inner loops that we've been talking about with the circular economy of sharing, the maintaining and prolonging and reusing. But today I'm just going to talk about the sharing and the maintenance and repairing, because these really struck us as something that's actually being led a lot of this by the Southwest. So that was quite exciting. So repair, this has grown, and we might say it's a trend at the moment, but also out of necessity, lots of people are turning to the idea of repair. Academic ideas go back quite a long time. There's quite interesting papers from the 1970s around feminism and the idea of repairing the planet. But we see this trend at the moment. So the repair shop on BBC One, primetime viewing. We also see, I'm not going to say this right, kintsugi, the Japanese art of fixing things and visible mending. Also see here, this is a patch on some jeans, again, the visible mending, and a trend in tear downs. So this is, there's a picture of a drill from the book, Things Come Apart. So if you look on YouTube, you'll find lots of tutorials on how to take things apart and reassemble them and fix them in the meantime. There's also a political movement that is making manuals free to download. The iFixit group have been really promoting this, and one of their aims is to get everyone to understand how to fix things and demystifying the magic. I think this is what a lot of these repair initiatives are doing, which is that a lot of us are too scared to look inside of our products. They seem to work as if by magic, but actually if you take the back off, you'll see that they're quite simple, but also quite complex in where items come from. And we see that down in the bottom corner was just something from a newspaper article on how I did at my house using only junk and stuff I found. And then we see more of these coming into general sort of mainstream media. And I think it's quite interesting that we have these sort of this narrative and this trend, but also how this is coming out, this sort of circular imaginary is fitting into these, but also how then these are coming into different policy and strategies. So we have London had their first repair week last week, and they have said that the repair economy is central to their circular waste strategy. And they're trying to bring all different groups across London together and have a repair quarter. But it's not without politics. The sticker here shown is perhaps shows the power of the sticker. So these were stickers that are on a lot of electrical items. So your warranty is invalid if you remove these stickers, but they're actually shown to be illegal and have absolutely no merit. But that power of seeing a sticker has been enough to put a lot of people off of taking the backs off their products. A lot of people, there's been legal cases against the right to repair movement, particularly iFixit for making manuals freely available. But we see this shift with France now introducing a repairability index in January, which will show how repairable, serviceable, and whether you can get parts for your product. So you will have more information when you buy new products of whether they're fixable. Another problem that people have been fighting against and fighting for new laws is planned obsolescence, where things are actually designed not to be fixed and designed that only have a limited lifespan. But repair cafes is a movement that has been sort of gaining in currency, and we have some of these in the southwest, which are pop-ups, but a lot of them are regular, take place sort of once or twice a month to repair things. Again, going on to this trend, but also to share knowledge. So our next case study was looking at sharing, and again, this is on the increase. There's been a lot of initiatives that have been around for a long time, such as toy libraries and nappy libraries, but libraries, things are on the increase that do more general products and are getting quite high tech in some places. We have the Crystal Palace library of things in the top corner, where you can sort of book on an app and then go and collect your goods. We have car sharing and bike sharing, and this has led to lots of both public and academic interest in talk about the commons, but also about how we design our cities and the infrastructures around sharing. So quickly I'll move on to this, but hopefully time for questions afterwards. Sharing and repairing in Devon and Cornwall. As I said, in many ways they've led this. We have more sharing libraries than anywhere else in the country for regions doing the general stocks. We have the first ever mobile sharing library, which is run out of Totnes Share Shed and serves South Dartmoor. There's over 30 men in sheds groups which have shared access to resources and tools. I know of at least 4 sharing libraries in the planning stage and regular repair cafes. So in the top corner you can see that's just from the web page of one of the sharing libraries. I think that's the Share Shed at Totnes, but they all run on a similar basis, which is low cost membership, or you can use them as a guest, and then you can rent or hire equipment at a low cost. So a lot of these tools are sort of £1 a week to borrow. So you get the service of the tool, which is what people need, tools or household implements, or they've got tents and entertainment equipment, anything really that's in the picture for borrow don't buy. But you get the service of that, so you can go camping, but without the cost, without having to store it. So it's very popular, people who haven't got much space. and without the sort of waste and the raw materials. So it narrows it down. So it's the idea of sharing equipment as a community rather than needing to own it all as individuals and having it sat in a cupboard for the majority of the time. I think one of the things that comes out quite a lot, is repeated quite a lot, is the idea of the drill. And I use that quite a lot to think of the drill in its lifetime will usually be used about 13 minutes and the rest of the time it will sit in a cupboard. So these things could easily be shared around the community. And the ONS data showed that the average family spends £100 a year on tools, whereas you could actually share them amongst groups of you. So the co-benefits, I've just said, there's services without the financial outlay and without the environmental impact, but they're also given a lot of training and employment opportunities across the region. A lot of local collaborations. Borrow Don't Buy in particular has a lot of items that can be used to set up your own business, digital cameras, PA systems, etc. A lot of support for startups. And a social space and community hub was coming out of a lot of, particularly the repair cafes, that it's somewhere for people to go, it's people to meet up, people to learn new, or places for people to learn new skills. So finally, I'll just touch on a couple of these snapshots that we did. So these are really looking at the objectives of groups and their motivations, but also some of the impacts they had. So this is Proper Job in Chagford. So they do a number of different things, some reuse and resale, recycling, they do training workshops. They've gone from a yard that sells, a reuse yard where you can donate items and they will resell them, to now having a shop called Uptown and a cafe, and running regular training events, upcycling events. They also run a paint recycling service. So you can go there and get half pots of paint or end of line paints. And they in their own estimations, they recycle, I think it was like 34 tons of resources were recycled, reused 25 tons of furniture and 4,000 litres of paint. But on top of this, they now employ 20 people and have a lot of volunteers, and their estimated savings to the local economy through their contribution and savings is around £4 million, and in social benefits. So showing that for a very small town, Chagford, it's having quite a big impact. And finally, we also have Share. This was the first project that was in Frome, and this came out of a social enterprise group, and it was really about giving young people somewhere to learn and train and to run a business, but it's also now run as a sharing library and can also contribute to the startup of a lot of other businesses. And again, it sees itself very much as saving money as well as contributing to saving raw materials and carbon emissions. I think I'll bring that to the end now, because my voice is running out and the time. So yes, any questions, and I'll try to stop sharing this. But do email if you want any more information, because I do have the reports that outline quite a lot of the empirical data that we've been collecting.